Is a person allowed on a tombstone to write God's name, to write Elohim fully, without the kuf, without Elohim? And in general, what is the halacha about writing out God's full name? Not Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, let's bracket that, but at least El or Elohim. So this question was asked by a rabbi in New Orleans. And the answer is that it really is permitted unless you are concerned that the document on which it's written will somehow be thrown out or mistreated. We know that the poskim, the Gemara, often write the word El or Elohim in the full form, even if they're not writing a pasuk. And this occurs a good number of times in the writing of Tuvot and so on. Now, what's the logic behind this? Because the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah that there was a takana of the Chashmonaim that when they would write the dates, they would write so-and-so year for the Kohen Gadol Le'el Elyon. And that's what they would write on the shtarot, on the document. Now, the rabbis were opposed to this, not because it had God's name, El Elyon, but because monetary documents would get thrown out after they were done, and the name would be mistreated and not respectful for God's name. From which we understand that if there is no concern of that, then one is allowed to write God's name. And the Ramah writes in Yoredeya that God's name can be written in a book because you won't throw out a book. But in a letter that you'll throw out, there you shouldn't write God's name. And of course that goes to issues about all of the source sheets that are printed out, why you should be careful if you're printing from Bar Ilan to make the setting that it does not print out God's full name. It writes Elohim instead of El or Elohim. There's a separate question about the halachic status of things that are printed for the sake of being thrown out. We won't deal with that. But in general, for those types of things, pages, you should not. But for books, for documents, for things that will be properly treated, one is allowed. So certainly for a tombstone, which is going to be solid and last, there is no problem of writing God's full name. And ultimately, we are coming upon Shavuot. And in Shavuot, right at the top of the Aseret HaDibrot, is you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. But taking the Lord's name in vain is misusing God's name in an oath. And obviously, we have to treat God's name with honor and respect. And we can't actively destroy it. But to use God's name in a way that it will be preserved can be understood as a respect for God's name, and that God's name will be encountered and will be encountered in the right context to point us towards the God who gave us the 10 Commandments and the God who gave us the Torah. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Shavuot Sameach.